Okay, Neil, we're back again. Thank you again for your time. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. We're talking this time about stress. Now, this seems to be a major problem these days. And would you say that you're also finding this in your interactions with those that you serve?
Yeah, very much so. Wherever I go, wherever I do, people are talking about stress, and it it does bother me. It does worry me that this is such an issue because stress can do so much harm. It can really ruin people's lives. So I think it's essential that we take this subject seriously and do what we can to address it. Very much so.
So would you say that managers need to take more responsibility for the stress that their social workers experience and actually being able to manage it and address the stress issue within the workplace?
Yeah. As I see it, managers have a twofold responsibility. First of all, they're responsible for managing their own pressures to make sure that they don't get stressed, because let's face it, if they get stressed, they're not much use to the people they manage. So there are lots of self-care issues there and making sure that they keep their workloads within manageable limits. So that's one side of their responsibility. Then the other side of their responsibility, of course, is to make sure that their staff, their supervisees, are not getting stressed, that they're not getting overloaded, that workloads are within manageable limits. Now, I know there's a huge amount of work, the work just keeps coming, but there's no point giving people more work than they can cope with, because that's counterproductive. They actually achieve less.
Yeah.
If they're stressed, they're worried, they're anxious, they're in danger of going off sick, they're not being creative, they're not learning, and so on. It just creates a vicious circle, really. But what I would say, though, is that one of the problems in terms of managers supporting their staff and taking responsibility is that this has to go through the management hierarchy. So managers need to get support from their managers, and those managers need to get support from their managers. The whole system, in a sense, needs to be geared towards keeping pressures within manageable limits. Otherwise, the whole thing just becomes dangerous from a health and safety point of view.
So I'm hearing you talk about it's the hierarchy. What happens at the top affects what happens at the bottom.
Yeah, very much so. I think a lot of it is around leadership. And to my mind, a key aspect of leadership is shaping the culture in a positive direction. And a key part of that idea of culture is morale. You know, people often use motivation and morale interchangeably as if they're the same thing, and they're not. The difference is motivation is psychological and morale is sociological. And what I mean by that is whether you're motivated is up to you, whether I'm motivated is up to me. Motivation is an individual thing, whereas morale is a collective thing. It's the atmosphere, it's the culture, it's the ethos in a sense. And if what you've got is a culture of low morale, then that just deflates everybody. It makes the work much harder. And so trying to instill a higher level of morale is an important leadership challenge. But unfortunately, in my experience, a lot of people are not clear about that. So either they don't do it, or they do it in a very simplistic way. You know, they just go along trying to jolly people along and cheer them up and stuff like that. And that's like the equivalent of saying to a depressed person, "Why don't you cheer up?" You know, that it's just at best it's worthless, and at worst it actually makes the situation worse.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. 100%. I think you've hit so many nails on the head there. And I guess I want to ask you then, how important would you say culture is within the workplace, you know, the organizational culture and all of this stuff around stress and, you know, managing caseloads and the like?
For me, it's crucial because a culture is very powerful. It's one of the most powerful things in an organization, and one of the reasons it's powerful is because it influences us without our knowing it.
Yes.
If I try to influence you, for example, then you will know I'm trying to influence you and you can resist that influence. But if you're being influenced in a way that you're not aware of, it's just because that's the norm, that's what happens every day, then that has much more power over you in a sense. So if you've got, for example, a culture that's negative, cynical, defeatist, if you've got a culture that is, in a sense, unhealthy, then what it does is it creates vicious circles. So what you'll have is a group of people who are struggling with their workload. And then as a result of that, a negative, low morale culture develops. And if that low morale culture isn't challenged and transformed through good leadership, then what that does is it drags people down. So that the lower morale is, the less energy there is for people. And so that makes the job more difficult. The more difficult the job is, the more people struggle to cope. The more people struggle to cope, the more likely they are to get stressed. The more stressed they are, the lower morale will be. So can you see what's happening? There's a vicious circle.
Domino effect.
Yeah, there's a vicious circle develops. And then that vicious circle can lead to other vicious circles. So one vicious circle I'm very aware of is where there's a lot of stress, is people start to think that stress is normal. So I've lost count, for example, the number of times I've had to challenge people when they say things like social work is a stressful job. And I've had to say, no, social work is a pressurized job. But if you're stressed by it, in other words, if the level of pressure is doing you harm, then that's telling you there is something wrong, either in terms of the level of the workload, the support you're getting, or lack of support, or whatever, or it's the culture that is dragging people down. But if social work were a stressful job, it means that everybody in social work would be stressed. And that's clearly not the case. So we have to have a deeper understanding of what stress is and not mix it up with pressure, because pressure can be a positive thing. It can motivate us. It can be enriching, whereas stress is where pressure reaches a level where it is causing harm, where it is making us ill. It's affecting the quality or quantity of our work. It's affecting our relationships. It's creating vicious circles and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Is so well explained. So what do you think people should do to make sure they don't get stressed, or that they're managing stress a lot better than they are?
Well, I think the first thing is, following on from just what I was saying a moment ago, is to understand the difference between pressure and stress.
Mm-hmm.
People often talk loosely about stress to mean any sort of pressure. And that's fine. I'm not saying they shouldn't do that. But we have to recognize that in a technical, official, or legal sense, stress is where the pressure reaches a level that is causing us harm, where it is too much pressure, for example. And so it's a problem. So when people say, for example, things like, well, stress is good for you, that's misleading, because it's pressure that is good for you if that pressure is at a manageable level. Or if the pressure has reached a level where it is making you ill, reducing your effectiveness, affecting your relationships, and so on and so forth, how could you possibly say that's good for you? So first thing is, be clear about pressure is what we get paid for. Any job, there will be pressure, and that's the deal. You take the pressure and you get the salary in exchange. So we can't complain about being under pressure. But when the pressure gets so high that it is, as I say, affecting our health, quality of work, and so on, then that becomes a health and safety issue. Because what employers should not be doing is allowing their employees to be harmed by their job. So some people, for example, on training courses have said to me, but aren't you just playing with words there, Neil, about pressure and stress? And I've had to say, no. This distinction is crucial, because if you're under pressure, that's what you get paid for. But if that pressure is reaching a level where it is harming you, you're not paid to be harmed by your work. That is a breach of health and safety legislation. So, and that's, to me, is the distinction between pressure and stress in its formal, technical sense. There's a parallel here with the use of the word trauma. You know, that we will be clear that a trauma is a psychological wound, for example. It's not just something that's a bit distressing in its technical, official sense. But you'll often hear people using trauma or traumatic in a much looser, everyday sense. You know, you'll have people saying things like, oh, my commute into work was dreadful this morning. There was roadworks and there'd been an accident. It took twice as long as normal. It was quite traumatic. And of course, it wasn't. It wasn't traumatic. It may have been a pain. It may have been distressing even, but it wasn't traumatic. It wasn't a trauma. But that's fine. If we know we're using the language loosely, no problem. But can you see how there's a direct parallel there in terms of stress? People often say things like, I'm stressed. And we have to stop and ask, are you stressed or are you under pressure? Are you coping with this? Is it harming you? And so if it is harming you, it's reached that level, then you have to do something about it. You have to take steps.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons for this is that the health and safety legislation applies to employees as well as employers. So if I were an employer, for example, I'm under a legal duty to safeguard my staff from undue hazards. But then employees are under a legal obligation to safeguard themselves from undue harm. So as an employer, I would have to make sure, for example, that electrical connections are properly earthed. But then employees would have to make sure that they're using electrical equipment safely and sensibly. It's a shared responsibility. The same applies to stress. So that brings us back to this idea of self-care. People have to take self-care seriously. So coming back to your question about, what steps do people need to take? Basically, it's about be clear, are you stressed or is it just an uncomfortable level of pressure? And if it is stress, then it has to be taken seriously as a health and safety matter. Yeah. So
I love that. I love that. And there are a couple of things that you said that I just want to go back to, because you spoke about, there's this thing about taking responsibility and ownership, and it's a dual process. It isn't just your employer, to some extent, you've got cases coming in, you have to allocate them out, right? Unless you there have been some places I've been in where they say, okay, we're closing our doors because we can't take any more. That's a rarity, because if you're in a lot of social workers I speak to on the front line, so then the referral and assessment, that often case does not happen where they just shut the doors. The long-term teams can do it, but you can't at the front door. And so, in as much as, yes, the employers have a responsibility, I always tell social workers, you also have a responsibility to say, I can take no more. And you've spoken about that and touched upon that, and understanding the difference between stress and pressure. And this is something that I talk about a lot to my social workers, about being clear, what are you feeling, naming your feelings, being able to share them, knowing the difference between your feelings and why you're feeling the way you're feeling. Those are really important steps in terms of the work that we do in the frontal lobe, in emotional intelligence, and how we're then perceiving the situation. So I think you've picked up on some really key things there that I think really contribute to the stress that social workers do feel. When you're internalizing something that isn't really as stressful as you're making it out to be, you're adding to your problem, as opposed to using emotional intelligence that tells you, I've got the resources to deal with this. And then that frees you up to really know when you're really in that stressful mode where the pressure is turned up, and where you need to be saying to your manager, I actually need to take time off. So I think those are brilliant things that you've drawn out. So what about supporting others? Because we're talking about managers supporting, social workers, and social workers supporting themselves and advocating for themselves, but what about supporting others, and how important is that?
Well, taking the second bit first, how important it is, it's crucial as far as I'm concerned. One of the things I've been talking a lot about to various people lately is what I refer to as the continuum or spectrum of well-being interventions. And what I mean by that continuum is that most of the stuff tends to be around individuals. So if you look at how to cope with stress, that sort of thing, time and workload management, all those issues tend to focus on the individual. There are, huge numbers of books being written on that subjects around these issues, but they all seem to imply that it's all about individual matters. Now, what I want to do in terms of this idea of the continuum of well-being interventions is to broaden that out. So the next step along the way, as it were, from the individual is the team. And I think there has to be team support. People have to support one another. And in particular, they have to be tuned into that culture. So if there is a culture of negativity, defeatism, cynicism, a culture that takes it for granted, if you work here, you're going to be stressed. Just get used to it, which is sadly something I've come across a lot. And if people are feeding that culture, keeping it alive, as it were, then that does a lot of harm. But if people are actually challenging that culture, trying to change it, then that can do a lot of good. People can feel much more supportive. If people are saying, hey, we're under a hell of a lot of pressure at the moment, let's pull together and support one another, rather than reinforce this idea that, well, you're going to get stressed, just face it, which is very, very dangerous assumption to make. For example, I've done a lot of work with students who have told me that when they've been out on placement, they've really struggled for that reason, that they have been basically told, well, if you're going to be a social worker, you're going to be stressed, just get used to it. And I've taught them about this difference between pressure and stress. And they've told me that they've struggled with that when they're on placement, because there is this tendency to mix up pressure and stress, and people to say, you're going to be stressed. It's the technical term for it is normalization. That stress becomes normalized, and it shouldn't be. Stress is basically a breach of health and safety. It's basically saying there are things going on in this organization that are harmful to health and safety. So the team is the next on the level of this continuum of wellbeing interventions. But then I think you need to look at the whole organization. You'll make it wider still in terms of what is the culture of the organization, what is the quality of leadership. Are people in leadership positions actually making life easier for their staff, or in some cases, making things harder? And then ideally, we should then take it beyond that into the world of work itself, which is now beginning to change in terms of issues around health and well-being taken more seriously, for example. But there's still this dominant way of thinking that the world of work is based on exploitation. So people in senior positions, whether they are owners, managers, whatever, will often think in terms of the relationship with the workforce is one of exploitation. How can we get as much out of people for as little cost as possible? Which creates negativity, it creates resentment, it creates sabotage, it demotivates, it demoralizes people, and so on. Whereas what I've been talking about in my work is think about it not as about exploiting employees, but exploiting opportunities for people to work together for mutual benefit. So we're talking about empowering staff rather than dumping work on them and exploiting them. And so I hope that makes sense in terms of what I mean, a continuum of wellbeing interventions from individual support, team support, organizational support, and ideally, what we need to do is actually change the nature of the world of work to make it more user-friendly in a sense.
Absolutely. And I love everything that you've said, because, again, that a lot of the work that I do with social workers who want to become independent, when they come to me, we are talking a lot about self-care. There's always an element of self-care and what's going on in the workplace. And it is this organizational culture of pessimism, of it's never going to get any better. I just need to ride it out for as long as I can and then escape, right? And so I love the idea that you're talking about them taking ownership, but also together, collectively, being able to take ownership and supporting one another, and then that filtering down even from the leadership downwards. I think a lot of social workers also that come to me, they talk about feeling quite exploited, like getting squeezed for as much energy as they can possibly muster up, for as little as whatever they're given. And I think the same is true whether they're permanent workers or agency workers. I think people who are agency workers are really feeling the brunt and experiencing it. I know legislation has changed, and they're under umbrella companies on a PAYE, and they've got entitlement to various other things, but they still feel as though they're out on a limb, they're on their own, and they've just been exploited. So I think this thing around care and self-care is important. And I think them having an understanding, I'm hearing a lot about you talking about having insight into what's happening and the process, and that putting them in a position where they can make different decisions for themselves, and them being supported in the organization that they're in to actually do that. So I love that. Do you ever get stressed as an independent?
No is the short answer. I get, because I do lots of different things for different people, sometimes I can get a bit of a log jam. So I'm under a lot of pressure, so for example, I may be busy on trying to meet a publisher's deadline, and then something else crops up where I've got to do something quickly, and then I might have, because I do a lot of, or have been doing a lot of expert witness work, I may then get a letter or an email from a solicitor saying, thank you for the report you did 6 months ago. We've now had a meeting with the barrister, and we would like you to answer the following questions. And there's 20 questions from the barrister. Yeah. And they're saying, ideally, we'd like your replies by next Tuesday. And I'm thinking, how am I going to fit that in? So I am well aware of pressure. I get a lot of pressure, but I don't get stressed in the sense that I control that pressure. Yes. And that's one of the beautiful things about being independent, of course. But even if you're not independent, even as a paid employee, there are still things that you can do. Because one of the things I'm very aware of, and I've been aware of literally for decades, is when it comes to stress, a key factor is control. Because if people feel they haven't got control, that's when the stress starts. When people feel at risk, they feel vulnerable, they feel they can't protect themselves because this is something beyond their control. That can make a huge difference. So you can have, for example, somebody who's under immense pressure, but they're not the slightest bit stressed because they have control over that pressure. You can have other people who are under quite a modest level of pressure, but they're quite stressed because they don't have control over that pressure. So for me, a key aspect of it is control, is to look at what can you control and control it, make sure it happens. So that's part of the ownership, part of the empowerment, in a sense, is control what you can.
Yes,
makes a huge difference.
And I think that goes back to what we were saying a little while ago about, understanding how you're perceiving and what is the narrative that you're giving around the situation, because that helps you to put things into perspective, to know, is this pressure or is this really a stressful situation? And that also is encompassed with feeling that control and saying, okay, now I know what it is, what can I do about it? And feeling confident to do that. And I think part of it is also, Neil, having the resources. Once you've figured it out, it's now what what resources do we have? And I'm sure that's something when you talk about managers and organizations taking appropriate steps and creating the right culture, that it would include resources that help their staff manage. So this has been fascinating, a really, really deep dive into stress and understanding the importance of social workers managing stress, understanding the difference, and even to a greater extent, the organizational culture changing and really shifting, especially during this time where social workers are feeling very stressed, not just pressured, but very stressed, going off sick, and actually their work coming into their home. So their home is no longer sacred. And I think this is the right push at the right time for this kind of development in self-care. So it has been a wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Is there anything that you want to add before we wrap it up?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Just a couple of things, just briefly. One is to go back to the idea of organizational culture for a moment. One thing I want to emphasize there is that a lot of people have told me over the years that cultures take a long time to develop, therefore they take a long time to change. And I'm afraid that's just not true. At the end of the day, a culture is just a set of habits. Cultures can't fight back. They are habits, unwritten rules, taken for granted assumptions. Cultures persist because people turn up on a Monday morning and carry on where they left off on Friday afternoon. The habits and practices can continue. And so it's quite possible in most situations to change cultures quite quickly. So, for example, if you've got a culture where people don't communicate, you can change that culture by starting to communicate. If you have a culture where people do nothing but moan all day and don't do anything about it, you can change that culture by people not moaning and saying, okay, if we're not happy, what can we do about this? And doing what they can do. And if there's nothing they can do about it, then accepting that as inevitable and getting on with their lives. But just sitting around moaning about things they can't change just feeds vicious circles, feeds cynicism and negativity. And low morale. The thing that can stop cultures changing is vested interests, in the sense that if it doesn't suit certain people for the culture to change, then they might resist that. But then that's something that can also be dealt with as well. But I just want people to not have this idea that a culture is something that's sort of written in tablets of stone and you just have to accept it. That's the way it is. Cultures are just the dead weight of habit. They can change and sometimes very easily change if you know what you're doing. So that was one thing. The other thing was just to say that one of the books I've written is called the Managing Stress Practice Manual. So for anybody watching this who feels they want to know more, then I'd suggest that's where you look. The Managing Stress Practice Manual. You can get it from Amazon or from my Academy website. That's it. And then I suppose just as well, just briefly to finish off, is to say I'm very active on social media. So if people want to connect with me on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and so on, then I welcome that. And you can also find out more about me and my work at neilthompson.info. So thanks, Nicole. That's been really helpful and I've enjoyed it.
I've enjoyed it too. Thank you, Neil. It's been great. Speak to you again soon.
Yeah. Cheers, Nicole. Thanks. Bye now.
Cheers.